Hey friends, welcome to the Canyon Pathways podcast, where we invite you to live like a son and lead like a father. Canyon Pathways is a global community of men on the journey from the striving of servanthood to the freedom of sonship as we traverse the canyon that is midlife leadership. My name is Noel Bouché, and I'm the founder and part of the leadership team for this venture, and I'll be your guide throughout this podcast as we explore and discover what it means to live like a son so we can lead like a compassionate father. Great to be with you for this episode in which we are looking at our field note on risk. Our field notes at Canyon Pathways are short essays on a particular word, which we believe embodies a concept that is relevant, if not central, to the journey into sonship, of living like a son of God, moving, as we say, from servanthood to sonship, moving from bondage and obligation and being duty-bound in this season of midlife leadership and into the freedom of sonship. So we're looking at risk. Risk has come up out in the field as we've journeyed with men around the globe, and it's an interesting word. Risk sounds risky, so to speak. Just kind of immediately grabs you, either creating a sense of fear and anxiety or exhilaration, depending on our makeup, our demeanor, our disposition, personality, strengths, experiences, or maybe the season we're in. It just creates that in us, a sense of risk. And it brings a couple things to my mind, a couple phrases. I mean, we've all, worked enough in this stage of our lives and our professional career, our leadership endeavors, where we've, one way or another, had to manage risk. We've had to address it. We've had to identify it, respond to it. We've had to counsel others through it, and we've had to plan. One phrase that comes to mind is risk aversion. We might find that we are averse to risk, or see someone who is averse to risk, and it's an interesting experience when we walk through it or when we see it, and it begs the question: why aversion? Why am I averse to it? What is it about it that I am averting? Interesting question, one we have to answer as we face risk in our lives, something that either is or appears to be risky, something that is asking us to risk something. Why am I averse to it? Why? Why is that my response? Also brings to mind risk tolerance, kind of expanding the assessment out a little bit, to more of a spectrum. Where am I on that spectrum of risk tolerance? Where am I right now? Is it different than where I was 6 months ago, or 6 years ago, or 20 years ago? Why is that? How much risk can I tolerate? How much risk can my team, my organization, my venture, my community, my family tolerate in this season? That's part of our job too, as we lead through volatile and uncertain times and seasons and places and circumstances, market conditions. Risk management, and really specifically, risk mitigation is another phrase that comes to my mind. I was watching one of the NFL games recently, and the color commentator was commenting on quarterback, one of the franchises, and was making the comment that quarterback's first job is to mitigate risk. And that jumped out at me. I mean, having played quarterback for a while, I understood it, kind of a baseline level. At the same time, it's like, it's not always the first job. Sometimes it is the primary job given circumstances, down and distance, score, clock, other game time decisions, to take risks, to initiate risks, to stretch the defense, to go long. That can also be the job. So how do you manage that? When is it time to mitigate risk? When is it time to take risk or initiate risk? Risk is interesting like that. And it's central to life, central to being a mortal being. Nothing is guaranteed. And so everything, to some degree, is risky. And yet, some things feel riskier than others. Sometimes we're more sensitive to risk than others. Perhaps it's a life stage thing. There's a Churchill quote that I'm not going to quote directly here just because it is put in a political context, but I want to keep it and look at it and take it outside of that. But in essence, it compares the early stage of life, of adulthood, It says there's a sense of liberalism that is embedded in it. Whereas in the older years, uh, the end of life, there is a conservatism that is embedded in it. And again, looking at that from outside any type of political spectrum makes sense. When you're younger, you're gonna be testing, you're gonna be pushing, you're gonna push boundaries, you're gonna explore a little bit more, let's say in your 20s, than you will in your 70s and 80s. It's different for every individual person, but generally, broad strokes, that's the way it goes. And so there's more of a conservatism at the end of that life cycle. And that conservatism grows to conserve, literally to conserve what has been earned, what has been accomplished, what has been whatever hard won or now is cherished. Risk tolerance will decrease because there is a sense of conservation of what is. Whereas in our younger years, there's a pushing, there's a testing, there's a growing that's necessary. It's like a plant pushing through the soil, deepening its roots, and that changes. So like when you're 22 years old, it's a little easier to pack up 2 bags and move across the country than when you're 50, 60, 70, 40, 45, and you've got a family and you've got a job and you've got a spouse and you've got asset base, a little different calculus. So it changes throughout life, our sense of risk, how we're managing it. And, in the Canyon Pathways community, this has come up a number of different ways. Some of us are risk averse. We fear that which seems risky right now, and it's keeping us stuck. It's keeping us frozen. It's impeding growth and progress in our spiritual lives, in our relational lives, maybe in our financial and professional lives. It's creating inertia out of anxiety and fear. Some of us maybe that taking too many risks in this stage need to just wait, pause, think through. Maybe we're carrying into this season a kind of approach that was the appropriate 10 or 20 years ago in our career or in our life. Now we need to slow down. Let's consider others. Let's consider the community. Let's consider all the people that you have influence over. And we might need to space this out and truly mitigate risk, not just for self, but for people in our community. So lots to think about, lots to assess, but let's pause there and let's go to the field note and see what discoveries we made as we dove into this word and this concept of risk. Risk. People who don't take risks generally make about 2 big mistakes a year. People who do take risks generally make about 2 big mistakes a year. Peter Drucker. In a pivotal scene from the film adaptation of The Two Towers, the fearful, conservative, grief-stricken King Theoden considers his course of action as the leader of a war-weary, vulnerable nation. Gandalf and Aragorn, who have just arrived and have already demonstrated their trustworthiness as advisors and advocates by delivering Theoden from a state of spiritual stupor induced by the enemy, counsel the king to fight by riding out and meeting the foe head-on. The self-doubting king's response is defiant and defensive. I will not bring further death to my people. I will not risk open war. Open war is upon you, whether you would risk it or not, is Aragorn's realism-infused reply. Like the good king, many of us invest much time and energy attempting to avoid risks that are already upon us. Whether the perceived risk is emotional, financial, professional, reputational, marital, we argue against action in order to avoid provoking the dreaded danger that our mind is fixed on. All the while, we are expending personal resources managing risk while also shouldering the opportunity costs of not taking the risk in the first place. Risk, it seems, is a double-edged sword, and accordingly, I tend to have a love-hate relationship with it. In certain circumstances, I like to breathe deep and take the plunge, usually in the context of people and places. I've moved across the country and around the world with little more than a goal and a gut feeling, and I've gone all in on certain relationships, even when disputes, disappointments, or flat-out betrayals might have made the investment seem far too risky. In other cases, though, my risk profile is different. I'm generally conservative in my portfolio and normally hesitant to place big bets with my assets, financial or otherwise. To wit, back in my playing days, film sessions would often reveal that I too often held the ball to avoid a turnover, rather than pulling the trigger and letting my receiver make a play. Yet, what I'm realizing in this season, and what decades of living and leading teaches most of us, is that risk is not just unavoidable in life, it is inherent to life. To live is to risk, and to be fully alive is perhaps to risk continually. The word itself leads us on an interesting journey of discovery. The English term risk has its origins in ancient Greek seafaring, where risa, meaning a root, stone, or piece of land, came to represent a danger to be avoided while navigating a ship. From the Greek, it passed into Latin and then to Italian, Spanish, German, all meaning in effect risk, hazard, danger. By the 18th century, however, the term had evolved from denoting simply an obstacle to be avoided to a positive connotation of the chance taken in any economic enterprise. In Middle German, it had even come to mean the daring hope of economic success through a new venture. An alternative theory of the word's origin is even more intriguing. Quite possibly, it came into English from across the Mediterranean, where the Arabic root meant provision, and from an Aramaic and Persian source, even implied daily bread. Daily provision, hardly something to be avoided. Indeed, the record is replete with the testimonial evidence of sons throughout history who discovered that risk-taking meant daring to experience uncertain environments for the sake of promised provision. At times it was journeying into the desert, sometimes not journeying from it, entering into the promised land or not fleeing from it, speaking truth to power or simply representing power, receiving outsized returns or rejecting the professional positions that made those returns possible. The Creator, it seems, has nothing against risk. Indeed, as has been pointed out by others, faith might just as well be spelled R-I-S-K. If so, then what we refer to as risk tolerance could be thought of as our fear index. And fear, lo and behold, is the thing that both robs us of the returns we hope for and wrecks the true relationship we so desire. To live is to risk. And perhaps, with apologies to Robert Frost, to choose the risk less taken is to live fully. That will make all the difference. Joseph of Arimathea took a risk and went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Mark 15:43. There's our field note on risk, and a really fun one to dive in to and look at and pen for me, because there were things that spoke right to me as I dug into the word, but also just an interesting word. Risk is so subjective. We think kind of like a lot of things in life. We kind of get black and white, and we want and have a default towards certainty and concreteness. And we think about that way with risk. We have a perspective, a lived experience where we might say that right there is risky, or that thing is a risk, and yet it's subjective. What is for one person is not risky for another. What's a risk for one group is not risky for another. It's like a lot of things. One man's trash is another man's treasure. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. We might say one man's big risk is just another Tuesday for another dude. It's different for each one of us. And so that's something that is interesting, and also goes to this journey of living like a son, because we are unique in that way. And the Father knows us as a son. He knows that thing that maybe comes easily and does not create the anxiety for that person, for that brother, for that individual, it does for us. It does for us because of how we've been fearfully and wonderfully made, because of our disposition, because of our unique mix of skill sets and relational style and communication style and our own wounds and experiences. That's different. And it's a very interesting thing about risk. And it requires a couple things when we can grasp hold of that. One, that we not compare ourselves to others. Two, that we take the time to understand why that person is struggling with that decision or that circumstance, why it is inducing anxiety, why it feels risky to them when it might not to us. Interesting. And three takeaways for me as I look at it and reflect on the field note. One is to live is to risk. One of the things that jumps out at us is to live is to risk. We say that there's no risk, no reward in life, and low risk, low return is another thing we identify. But regardless, there's still risk. It's still risky just to be alive, and whatever choices we make, whatever path we choose, there are risks inherent to it. So whatever it is, to desire is to risk. Risk what? Risk dissatisfaction once we acquire that thing that we've desired. To love, obviously, is to risk. Why? Because we might face loss and rejection. To change is to risk. It's to risk unfamiliarity. We don't know what's going to come when I change. It's different. It's new. It's stretching. I don't have control over it. I don't have a concrete picture of what's going to come. It's unfamiliar. To go is to risk. It's to risk that I might not return. To stay is to risk. To risk the fact that I might not discover. To learn is to risk grief. To ignore is to risk ignorance. To fight is to risk injury. To hide is to risk being found. There is risk inherent in being alive as a human being. But in being alive as a human being, we are alive as an image bearer of the Most High God. And when we step back and just accept that that's part of this life of faith, we start to develop a comfort level with it. And we begin to, accept that that's part of this journey. And it has been for sons and daughters throughout history. I mean, Abraham and Sarah, you know, go out from your country to a land you know not. Why? Because I'm promising you an inheritance that you're not going to see for a while. And what they do? They went out, not knowing whither they went, as the old King James says. And by the way, they didn't do it in their 20s when they were just a bunch of young marrieds and had nothing to lose. They were 75 years old. Leave all this. Go out into the wilderness, through the desert, to this place. That's the life of faith. Continually pushing out of a comfort zone. And that's, I think, one thing we in this stage, one thing is we start living like a son, we start getting stretched and we recognize, wow, I had a comfort zone. When I was living as a servant, I can do that all day long. Really easy. It's starting to get easy. I'm in midlife leadership. I got things I've proven. I've got some position, some title. I do X, I get Y. That's living like a servant. And there's expected outcomes and there's a contract. And a lot of us fall into that in this stage of our leadership. We start to operate like an employee of God's estate instead of like a son and heir. But when we're living like a son, we will continually be called out into that land we don't know, called out to that next thing, to that next pasture, led with tenderness and grace to that place that is out of a comfort zone. And, we've developed a comfort zone by this time in our lives. I mean, it's a comfort zone, essentially a set of behaviors that feels safe to us. In fact, it's a set of behaviors, not only does it feel safe, it is so safe that when we bump up against new things, we revert back to it. We revert back to that zone of comfort, of ease. And that's what the Spirit is calling us out of, that comfort zone, to a new set of behaviors, to be transformed into that son that is moving closer and closer to the Father's heart. That is risk. It's calling us out. It's a beautiful thing, but we have to heed the call and obey the call and trust that it's a good Father leading us out of this place that feels so safe. Secondly, the word itself reflects not only the subjective nature of risk, but the journey that I think this riskiness of life, this inherent risk, is being experienced by us as we walk through this stage of life, this midlife leadership stage. So the word itself, we don't even know where it comes from. There's a mystery to it. Could be rooted in ancient Greek seafaring, where the word risk, the root of our word risk meant a danger, a tree, a root, something that could sink your ship, take you down altogether. Could be that. Could be as it moved, through the Middle Ages into the Renaissance and that Germanic root of the word. Oh, it's yeah. There's a threat, but No risk, no reward. There's a potential reward. There's a potential return in this enterprise. So, we take that forward, and a lot of us have operated in, maybe you've been in the VC space, maybe you've been in venture capital or started a venture backed uh, business. And that's the mode we're operating in. Say, hey, yeah, I'm going to take a shot. Of course, this is the time to do it. I'm going to place my bet and go. And yet I know 75% of startups fail, 80%, failure rate of VC investments, very high. But boy, that possible return just draws me out. I can't say no to it. Maybe that's where we are in our experience. But then what about this last thing, the potential that this word comes to us out of the Arabic and out of even a Persian root that meant provision, that possibly meant daily bread. What if to risk is actually the daily bread that I'm supposed to be praying for? What if what I'm supposed to be interceding for in life is not protection from harm, from danger, from threats? What if it is daily bread that is going to bring life? Going out in the wilderness for the nation of Israel coming out of bondage, that was risky. Well, I mean, God is painting a picture of this faith journey to us. Your first steps are going to be into a wilderness where there's fiery serpents, where there's lack of water, perhaps, where there's enemies on all sides, where there's deep valleys and canyons, where there might be a perception of lack of resources and scarcity. But this is where I will form you. Follow me. Step out of the boat. Take a risk. Come to me. That leads right into the third takeaway, which is the inherent riskiness of relationships. And that's what our entire life is a set of relationships. And our faith journey, a primary relationship with our Creator and Redeemer. And what if that shows us that the main question, the main inquiry for my heart is not, what am I risking, but for whom am I taking risk? For whom am I putting myself out there? Is it for things or is it for others? We take risks all the time for return on our capital, for this new position, to develop our reputation and the esteem that we have in others. And that might be, that's anything, that's any decision. It could be a new venture professionally, but so many things outside of our control in that, and so many things that lead to undesired or unplanned for outcomes, and indeed a sense of failure. Most startups fail and are not profitable. And so many things are outside of our control. Could be macroeconomic factors, could be timing, could be a regulatory shift. I mean, it could be anything, not our talent, not our abilities, not the, uh, the, the nature of the product or the service or the business plan. Things are outside of our control and we still feel failure around it. But we almost never feel failure when we take risks for others in relationship. It's almost always viewed or experienced by us as humans as heroic, no matter what the outcome is. To give one's life for one's friends, for one's family, to lay down the fear, the anxiety, and just go to have that conversation, to be there, to fly across the country for that person, to change your schedule so you can be there for that thing for your son or daughter, to compromise, to pivot, to redirect, to reschedule something so you can be there for your spouse, to drop everything, to give of your time and your energy to love that person. That's heroic. That's risky, but it's at the nature of relationship. And it's, of course, what's been modeled for us by our Father from the beginning and also by this first son who came not to protect his position, but to step out of his position and risk everything, even his life, to save and to redeem us, that we might become sons among other sons. Risk, that's living like a son and accepting that risk exists and yes, assessing it, but then moving into it, that's leading like a father because we serve a good father. keeps asking us, do you trust me? Do you trust me? Do you love me? Don't be afraid. Let's take this step together. Let's walk this path together. Great discoveries. Here's 2 reflection questions to sit with. Is there an area of your life where you are avoiding taking a risk? Second, what would change if you viewed that risk not as potential danger, but an opportunity to receive provision from the Father? Friends, hope you're taking away a few things from this episode on risk, and I want to encourage you to check out the next episode. We're going to have a conversational approach to this topic with our community director, Luke Smith, and he's going to sit down with Todd Filbrin, who's been a part of the Canyon Pathways community since the beginning and has a very unique perspective because of his journey, his professional experience, and the man that he is on risk, and eager for you to sit in on that conversation and hear these brothers share really deep insights. Excited about it, so check it out. Check out the show notes for links, as well as a PDF with reflection questions. If you'd like to use this episode for personal reflection or in small group meetings, that'll be a nice tool for you. Subscribe so you catch all of our episodes as we develop a language of sonship through this podcast. Thanks to the team at Maroon Harpoon for producing the episode, and to our donors who make this venture possible. And as always, thank you for being a part of the Canyon Pathways community as we together live like sons and lead like fathers.